The iron chains cut deep into his wrists, but Cal Vane did not flinch. Silver burned like fire against his skin, yet he remained still, watching, waiting. He had faced death before. He had felt the bite of blades, the sting of betrayal, the rush of war. But nothing in his savage existence had prepared him for her. Celine Duskborn sat upon her throne of onyx, draped in silken black, her presence colder than the moon that bathed the chamber in ghostly silver light. She was not beautiful in the way mortal women were. She was something beyond beauty, a creature sculpted by the night itself, her pale skin luminescent, her lips like blood-stained velvet. Her glacial blue eyes pinned him with a gaze both amused and predatory. A lesser man would have bowed. A weaker man would have begged. But Cale was neither. He stood tall despite his chains, bare-chested, his body carved from muscle and shadows. The scent of his own blood filled the air, mixing with the distant fragrance of dying roses from the garden beyond the chamber. He had been dragged before her like a beast, yet he did not kneel. Celine tilted her head, lips curving into a slow, deliberate smile. "One word from me, and my pet will devour you, werewolf." The beast beside her stirred, a monstrous, fanged creature of twisted darkness, her personal enforcer, her mind-bound creation. Its crimson eyes burned with the unnatural fire of its mistress's command, waiting for her whisper to strike. Cal's golden gaze did not waver. "Then speak it." The words were deep, unshaken, edged with a low, rumbling challenge. He was shackled, bleeding, outnumbered, but fear had no place in his soul. He was the storm that could not be broken. Celine leaned forward slightly, intrigued. The dim torchlight traced the hollow of her throat, the delicate lines of her collarbone, the effortless elegance of her posture. He should have hated her. She was his enemy, a queen of his kind's most ancient adversaries, a woman who ruled over darkness and drank life from the throats of the dying. Yet Cale felt it, the pull. It was not mere attraction. No, this was something deeper, darker, a hunger neither of them should have dared acknowledge. A heat curled through his veins despite the silver burning into him, despite the knowledge that this woman before him could end his life with a flick of her wrist. Celine's fingers brushed over the stem of a wine glass, filled with something thick and crimson. She took a slow sip, her fangs just barely visible beneath those sinful lips, and he watched every movement as though caught in a trance. "You are fascinating, wolf," she murmured. "Most men would be on their knees, begging for mercy." Cale let out a dark, amused breath. "Mercy." His voice was deep, laced with something close to laughter. "I'd rather hear you moan my name." The chamber fell into utter silence. A ripple of shock flickered through the gathered nobles, their porcelain faces twisting in scandalized disbelief. Even the monstrous pet at Celine's feet let out a low, rumbling growl, sensing the shift in its mistress's aura. But Celine did not lash out. She did not strike him down or order his execution. Instead, her eyes burned with something far more dangerous than rage. Interest. For the first time in centuries, someone had dared speak to her without fear, dared to challenge her control, dared to look upon her not as a queen, but as a woman. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from her throne. The silk of her gown whispered against the marble as she descended the steps, her movements liquid, graceful, intoxicating. Cale remained still as she approached, as her presence wrapped around him like an invisible chain, pressing against his chest, his throat, his every sense. She stopped mere inches from him, tipping her head to the side, studying him as one would a rare and dangerous animal. "And if I wanted you to beg," she whispered, her voice smooth as silk. Cal's lips curved, the hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He leaned forward, so close now that he could feel the cold kiss of her breath against his heated skin. "Then you'd have to try harder, my queen." Celine's fingers trailed lightly along his jaw, her nails grazing his skin in a feather-like caress. A test, a warning, a promise. But Cale did not flinch. He never flinched. The tension between them crackled like a storm, undeniable. Dark, twisted fate had begun its dance, pulling them into something neither of them could stop. And Celine knew, in that moment, that this wasn't just a prisoner. This was the beginning of her undoing. The chains had been removed, but the tension remained. Cal Vane stood in the grand halls of Celine's palace, his golden eyes locked onto the woman who had bound him with something far stronger than silver. His body was free, his mind, his will, yet there was no escaping her. The moment she had stepped down from her throne, the moment she had touched him, the lines between predator and prey had blurred. Celine had led him through corridors of midnight stone, past walls where torches burned with cold blue flames. The air was heavy with the scent of dark roses, of ancient secrets whispered through time. She was toying with him, testing him, but Cale was not a man who played by another's rules. Now, he stood in a chamber of obsidian mirrors, their reflections catching glimpses of movement, of the slow prowl of a beast trapped in a den of ghosts. Celine stood before him, the very image of untouchable beauty, a creature sculpted from the moon's cold fire. "Why aren't you trembling, werewolf?" she murmured, voice like silk laced with steel. Her icy blue eyes traced the length of him, bare-chested, battle-scarred, undefeated. Cale tilted his head slightly, a smirk ghosting over his lips. The queen wanted fear. He would give her something far more dangerous. "You should have killed me," he said, voice deep, edged with challenge. Celine took a slow step forward, the long train of her gown whispering over the floor. "And yet here you stand," she mused, circling him now, her cold presence brushing against the heat of his skin. "I wonder, why?" He knew the answer. It was the same reason she had let him live, the same reason she had come so close, so dangerously close, despite every warning written in blood between their kinds. The pull. Cale could smell it, that wretched, exquisite lure of fate. It coiled in the space between them, thick like the air before a storm. It was madness. It was ruin. And neither of them could resist. She stopped behind him, her breath cool against his bare back. "Tell me, wolf," she whispered, "do you know what it means to dance with death?" Cale turned, too fast, too close, forcing her to tilt her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His hand lifted, slow, deliberate, until his fingers brushed the silk of her sleeve. The air between them crackled, the beast within him straining against control. "You think you are death," he murmured, voice rough, deep as thunder. Celine did not retreat. She did not waver. Instead, her lips curved, her fangs glinting in the low light. "I know I am." The shadows stretched long around them, wrapping them in a prison of their own making. She should not have let him this close. He should not have wanted her this much. But there they stood, monsters caught in a cruel, intoxicating fate. Celine raised a hand, tracing her fingers just beneath his jaw, as if studying a creature she could not quite understand. "Your heart races, wolf," she murmured, voice almost amused. Cale caught her wrist, not gently, not cruelly, but firmly enough that she knew he was no plaything. "Not from fear," he growled. Her lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in something far more dangerous. A breath of stillness passed between them. Cale could feel it. Her pulse, if she had one. Her hunger, if she could name it. Celine's other hand pressed lightly to his chest, just over the mark of his clan. He felt her breath as she whispered, "Then what are you afraid of?" His grip on her wrist tightened, just barely, just enough to remind her. She was not the only predator here. "I don't fear you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I fear what happens if I don't stop." For the first time, Celine did not have an answer. Cale knew he should leave, turn away, end this. But he didn't. Celine stood before him, her ice-pale fingers still resting against his bare chest. She was cold, yet burning, a paradox that made the beast inside him ache with something dangerously close to need. His golden eyes searched hers, trying to find weakness, an opening, a moment of doubt. But there was none. Celine was not some delicate noblewoman, nor a fragile, blood-drunk courtesan. She was a queen, a hunter, a creature of the night who feared nothing. And yet, she had not pulled away. Still not trembling. She murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, yet heavy with something neither of them dared to name. Cal's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smirk. He stepped forward, closing the last inches between them, forcing her back until the cold obsidian wall met her spine. His body radiated heat, a stark contrast to the winter chill of hers. "You're the one against the wall, vampire," he rumbled, his voice low, edged with challenge. "Shouldn't you be the one trembling?" Celine arched a brow, unshaken. If anything, her smile deepened, her fangs flashing in the dim torchlight. Amusement, confidence, a predator playing with her prey. "Is that what you think?" she breathed, her tone laced with dark amusement. Cale growled, his instincts warring with reason. She was testing him, taunting him. And damn it all, it was working. He reached up, his rough fingers grazing the side of her throat. No heartbeat, no warmth, only cold, silken skin that should have repelled him. But it didn't. His grip tightened just slightly, his claws threatening to extend, though he did not pierce her flesh. "You don't fear me," he murmured. Celine tilted her head, her silver blue eyes gleaming. "No," she admitted, her voice like a slow, dangerous lullaby. That single word sent fire through his veins. The beast inside him roared, demanding he take control, that he prove his dominance. He had spent his life as an alpha, a leader, a warrior. No one defied him. No one challenged him like this. No one except her. Celine lifted her hand, her cold fingers trailing up the hard ridges of his chest, following old battle scars like they were something to be rid. Cale did not move. He did not stop her. She leaned in, her breath feather-light against his skin. "Tell me, Wolf," she whispered, "why are you still here?" His jaw clenched. The answer burned in his throat. Because he couldn't leave. Because something deeper than instinct, darker than hunger, stronger than hatred bound him to her. She was poison, but he had already tasted her. And now, there was no cure. Cale suddenly pushed away, his hand slamming against the wall beside her instead, his breath ragged, his entire body taut with restraint. Damn her. Damn this. Celine didn't flinch. She simply gazed up at him, her expression unreadable. Then, ever so slowly, her fingers lifted, brushing his jaw. A deliberate act. A silent, lethal game. Her next words were spoken so softly, so intimately, they nearly undid him. "You're fighting it," she whispered. Cale exhaled sharply, his fists clenching. "I have to." Celine tilted her head, considering him, her fangs gleaming as she smiled. "No, you don't." And in that moment, Cale realized the most terrifying truth of all. He didn't want to fight anymore. Cale's breath was ragged, his body burning from the inside out. Every muscle in him tensed as if ready for battle. But this wasn't a fight he could win. Not against her. Celine stood still, her head tilted slightly, studying him like a predator amused by its prey's resistance. The flickering torches on the stone walls cast shadows across her perfect face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the pale glow of her skin. She was otherworldly, intoxicating, dangerous. And she knew it. "You think this is about control, don't you?" she whispered, her voice like silk woven with steel. "You believe if you resist, the beast inside you will stay caged." Cal's golden eyes locked onto hers. "I am not some rabid dog you can tame, vampire." Celine's lips curved, a slow, knowing smile. Who said anything about taming? She lifted her hand, her cold fingers grazing the side of his face, tracing the line of his jaw. His pulse pounded at the contact. A warning, a promise. Cale should have stepped away, should have torn himself from her touch. But he didn't. He stood there, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, letting her touch him. Celine's fingers trailed lower, down his throat, resting over his heartbeat. Her eyes darkened slightly, her hunger barely masked beneath her elegant poise. You burn so brightly, Wolf. A creature of fire and flesh, heat and hunger. She exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if savoring the very essence of him. Cal's hand shot up, gripping her wrist before she could move further. His touch was firm, unyielding, the heat of his skin searing against her unnatural coldness. Celine's eyes snapped open, silver meeting gold. For a moment, they only breathed, locked in a battle far deeper than any physical war. A struggle of wills, of desires, of a hunger neither of them dared to name. Then Cal pulled her closer, his grip still firm around her wrist, but his other hand now pressing against the curve of her waist. She didn't resist. A dangerous mistake. "You're playing with fire," he growled, his voice low, guttural. Celine arched a brow, her lips barely inches from his. "Good. I like the way it burns." Cal inhaled sharply, his control snapping like brittle glass. He pinned her against the wall, his body flush against hers, his grip tightening at her waist. She let him, not because she was weak, because she wanted to. Celine's breath was cool against his skin as she whispered, "Tell me, Cal, does it feel like a cage, or does it feel like freedom?" Cal's jaw clenched, his fingers digging slightly into her waist. She was breaking him down, piece by piece, breath by breath. "You think this is freedom?" he murmured, his lips brushing dangerously close to hers. "This is a curse." Celine smiled, slow and wicked. "Then why do you crave it?" Silence. Cal did not answer. Because she was right. Because every part of him, body, soul, beast, was screaming for her. She leaned in just a fraction, a whisper away from his lips. "Surrender, Wolf, just once." His control was a thread fraying at the edges, and he knew, one more breath, one more whisper, and he would fall. And for the first time in his life, Cal wasn't sure if he wanted to fight it. Cal's breathing was heavy, uneven. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to pull away, to resist, to fight. But he didn't move. Celine remained trapped between him and the cold stone wall, though they both knew she wasn't truly trapped. If she wanted, she could disappear into the shadows in the blink of an eye. She could turn to mist, slip through his fingers like a ghost. But she didn't. She stayed still, her silver eyes locked onto his, watching him with a mix of challenge and intrigue. Cal clenched his jaw, his fingers pressing into the curve of her waist, holding her there, as if anchoring himself in place. His body was rigid, trembling with the war raging inside him. She was a vampire, a creature he had been taught to despise, to hunt. And yet, he was drawn to her like a moth to the most beautiful, deadly flame. "You want to fight it," Celine murmured, her voice velvet and venom. "But tell me, Wolf, why does your body betray you?" Her cold fingers trailed up his forearm, brushing against the hard ridges of muscle, tracing the path of veins that pulsed with heat. She could feel it, the fire beneath his skin, the barely contained hunger that had nothing to do with blood. Cal's golden eyes burned like embers in the dim torchlight. He was dangerous, primal, feral, a beast on the edge of losing control. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he growled, his voice rough, edged with warning. Celine tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "And what am I doing, Cal?" "Testing me," he snapped, his fingers tightening around her wrist. "Playing with fire." She smiled, slow and wicked. "And yet, you haven't stepped away." He should. He should tear himself away, turn his back, remind himself what she was. But he didn't. Instead, he yanked her closer, his grip tightening at her waist, his chest pressing against hers. Celine gasped, not in fear, but in something far more dangerous. Surprise. Anticipation. "Tell me, vampire," he growled, his lips a whisper away from her throat. Why aren't you trembling? Her breath hitched, and for the first time, Cale saw it. Hesitation. A flicker of something raw behind her silver eyes. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Celine let out a soft, breathy laugh, her lips curving into that same knowing smirk. "Because I do not fear wolves," she murmured, her voice smooth as silk. "I command them." A dangerous statement. A challenge. Cale's grip tightened, his beast rising to the surface. "You think one word from you will make me kneel." Celine's fingers trailed up his chest, stopping at his throat, where his pulse thundered beneath her touch. "No," she whispered, "but I think one whisper from me will make you break." The air between them crackled, charged with something neither of them dared to name. It wasn't just desire. It was something darker, deeper, something forbidden. Cale's body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to run, to take, to destroy. Celine could feel it. She welcomed it. "Fight it," she whispered, her cold breath brushing against his lips. "Or don't." And for the first time in his life, Cale wasn't sure which one he wanted more. Cale's breathing was ragged, his pulse hammering like a war drum. His hand still gripped Celine's waist, fingers digging into her cold flesh. Every muscle in his body was coiled, caught in the unbearable tension between restraint and surrender. Celine smirked, her silver eyes gleaming like the edge of a blade. She had felt his hesitation, his battle, his torment, and she relished it. "You're shaking, wolf," she purred, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "What is it you fear more? That you'll lose control, or that you'll enjoy it when you do?" Cale snarled, his grip tightening in warning. But Celine didn't flinch. She leaned in, her lips so closed that the heat of his breath clashed against her own unnatural coldness. "I should end you," he growled, his voice rough, primal. Celine laughed, the sound low and knowing. "You should," she whispered, "but we both know you won't." Cale's body tensed, his instincts roaring at him to tear away, to break free from the spell she wove around him. But every time he tried to pull back, he found himself sinking deeper. Celine was not like the others. She was not prey. She was not weak. She was a queen of the damned, an untouchable force draped in midnight silk and cold beauty. And yet here she was, trapped in his grasp, her lips mere inches from his, daring him to lose himself. A dangerous game. A deadly one. Yet neither of them moved to stop it. Celine tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over him like a predator sizing up its kill. "Tell me, wolf, do you dream of me?" Cale growled, his fingers twitching against her waist. He did, and it was a curse. Every night she haunted him, a whisper in the dark, a shadow in his thoughts, a temptation he had no strength to resist. And Celine knew it. She thrived in that power, in the way he trembled beneath the weight of what he refused to name. Cale's golden eyes burned as he slammed her back against the stone wall, his chest pressing against hers, a silent war raging between them. Who would break first? Celine's breath hitched, not in fear, but in something far more dangerous. Excitement. Anticipation. "You want to own me," she whispered, her voice like silk-wrapped steel. "To claim me." Cale's jaw clenched. And yet, Celine continued, her fingers drifting down his chest, over the ridges of muscle that tensed beneath her touch. "You fear what that would make you." Cale's grip tightened, his beast clawing at the surface. She was right. To want her was to betray everything he was. To give in would mean losing himself entirely. But Celine's smirk deepened, as if she could hear the war raging inside him. "Don't fight it, Cale," she whispered, her lips brushing against his jaw, cold against burning heat. "You're already mine." A growl rumbled deep in his chest, his instincts screaming for violence, for possession, for release. He should have turned away. Should have walked into the night, and never looked back. Instead, he crushed her against him. Celine let out a sharp gasp, but she didn't resist. She welcomed the storm, the fury, the desperate hunger in his touch. For once, the werewolf had stopped fighting. For once, the vampire had stopped running. And for the first time in both their immortal lives, they surrendered. Kel's breath came hot and heavy, his body trembling with restraint as he held Celine against the cold stone wall. His grip was bruising, his fingers locked around her wrist, but she only smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that sent a deep shudder through him. "You still think you can fight this?" she whispered, her voice like the hush before a storm. Kel's jaw clenched. He was a beast of the wild, a creature of raw strength and instinct. No one had ever dared to play with him, to taunt him, to unravel him like this. Yet Celine stood before him, fearless, wicked, beautiful beyond reason. She was the one thing he could not break, the one thing he did not want to break. His fingers twitched where they held her. He should have released her, stepped back before this dangerous game burned them both. But instead, he dragged her closer. Celine let out a soft breath as she found herself pressed against his chest, her body impossibly cold against his heat. Her silver eyes flickered with something dark, something ancient, something thrillingly lethal. "You're afraid," she murmured. Cale growled, his golden eyes flashing. "Of what?" Celine smirked. "Of what you'll become if you take what you want." A deep, guttural sound rumbled in Cal's throat, his beast snarling beneath his skin. She was right. She had always been right. Loving her, wanting her, was the one thing forbidden to him. She was a vampire, the enemy of his kind. Yet nothing else had ever felt more right. Celine's cold fingers trailed up his chest, barely touching, but it was enough. Enough to ignite him, enough to undo him. "You don't scare me, Wolf," she whispered, her lips just a breath away from his. "You should, but you don't." Cal's grip tightened, a silent warning, a desperate plea. But Celine only tilted her head, baring the pale column of her throat in an unmistakable challenge. A heartbeat of silence stretched between them. Then Cal moved. With a snarl, he spun her around, pressing her back against his chest, his arms locking around her in a way that left no space between them. Celine gasped, her fingers gripping his forearm, but she did not struggle. She had won. Cal's lips hovered near her ear, his breath hot, ragged. "Is this what you wanted?" he growled, his voice edged with desire and fury alike. Celine let out a slow, satisfied breath. "Yes." Cal cursed under his breath. She was insufferable, dangerous, poison wrapped in silk. And he was lost. His grip softened, his hand brushing over her waist, feeling the unnatural stillness of her body, the cold perfection of her form. She was not made for a creature like him. And yet, he wanted her anyway. Celine turned in his grasp, looking up at him, her silver eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Then stopped pretending. Cal's breath caught. There were no more words, no more battles, no more reasons to fight. With a low, defeated growl, he pulled her in, claiming the moment, claiming her. And for the first time, neither of them ran. The wind howled through the ruined castle, carrying the scent of rain and blood. Thunder cracked across the sky, illuminating the two figures standing at the heart of the storm, a werewolf and a vampire, bound by fate, torn by war. Cal stood like a living shadow, his golden eyes burning with something raw, something primal. His body was tense, muscles coiled as if ready to strike, but he did not move. Not yet. Celine faced him, her silver eyes gleaming like shards of moonlight. She was still, otherworldly, as if she belonged to a different realm entirely. Yet here she stood, her delicate hands stained with the night's violence, her breath unsteady. She should have killed him. He should have torn her apart. And yet, they had only fallen deeper. "You know they will come for us," Celine whispered, stepping closer. Her voice was a blade wrapped in silk, a melody of warning and temptation alike. Cal did not flinch. He had known this moment would come. The pacts, the covens, they would never allow a bond like this to exist. But none of it mattered. Not anymore. You should have run while you had the chance, Cale growled, his voice rough with restraint. Celine tilted her head, a slow smirk curving her lips. And let you suffer alone, she murmured, her fingers trailing up his chest. No, Wolf. I am far too selfish for that. A deep, rumbling sound escaped Cale's throat. Half a laugh, half a growl. His beast wanted her, had wanted her from the very first moment. It was unnatural, impossible. But the truth was undeniable. You are my ruin, vampire, he murmured, his hands catching her wrists, holding her in place. Celine's eyes flashed with amusement, and something darker. Then embrace your downfall. The storm raged around them, rain slashing through the broken castle like silver knives. Lightning lit up the sky as Cale pulled her against him, his grip possessive, his warmth devouring her icy skin. There was no hesitation anymore. No doubt. No turning back. Celine pressed her palms against his chest, feeling the rapid, untamed rhythm of his heart. He was fire. She was ice. He was wild instinct. She was deadly grace. Yet somehow, they fit. You were meant to fear me, she whispered, her lips just a breath away. Cal's hand curved around her throat, firm but reverent, claiming without caving. His golden eyes blazed. You were meant to kill me, he countered. Celine let out a slow breath, her gaze never leaving his. Perhaps I already have, she whispered, pressing her hand over his heart. Cal's pulse pounded beneath her touch. He was a warrior, a hunter, a beast that could never be tamed. But in this moment, he was hers, and she was his. The world would not allow it. Fate would tear them apart. But for now, in the storm, in the dark, in the space between love and death, between hunger and surrender, they belonged only to each other.